It was a regular evening when Sam, the nephew, showed up at the door unannounced. He had been traveling and, for reasons he didn't explain, wanted to stay for the night. The house wasn't exactly set up for guests, but it wasn't a huge problem either. Carla, his aunt, was already winding down, ready to call it a night. But she didn't object. Sam wasn't a troublemaker, and they hadn't spent much time together lately. It seemed harmless enough. As the night wore on, Sam made himself comfortable on the living room couch. Carla and her partner, who had been looking forward to some quiet time, exchanged glances. The mood shifted slightly, though neither of them spoke about it. Carla's thoughts were elsewhere, and there was a sense of quiet discomfort in the air that neither could name. Perhaps it was just the suddenness of the visit, or maybe it was the way Sam seemed so at ease, like he belonged in a space that hadn't felt quite like his in a long time. Carla excused herself to the bedroom to get ready for bed, but she lingered for a moment at the doorway. The two men were talking, their voices low, and when she stepped inside, they quickly fell silent. The brief moment of tension was so subtle, so fleeting, that Carla almost convinced herself she was imagining it. She pulled the door closed behind her and lay down, trying to shake off the unease. But Sam wasn't the only one who seemed out of place. Carla had felt something stir in the air, a quiet tension that wasn't there before. She tried to ignore it, closing her eyes and focusing on the soft hum of the room. Still, sleep wouldn't come easily that night. The night dragged on with a strange heaviness in the air. The clock on the wall ticked away, each passing minute feeling longer than the last. Sam, still in the living room, seemed to have settled in, but the quiet hum of the apartment was different now. Carla had tried to shut the world out, retreating to her bed, but her mind couldn't rest. There was something she couldn't shake off, something that felt just a little too strange. In the silence of the dark room, Carla lay wide awake, staring at the ceiling, listening for anything out of place. Every little sound seemed amplified, the creak of the floorboards, the rustle of fabric. She heard the soft murmur of voices coming from the living room. They weren't loud, just low enough to make her wonder what Sam and her partner were talking about. She considered getting up, but something held her back. Maybe it was exhaustion, or perhaps it was a feeling she couldn't quite define. Sam's words came and went like whispers in the dark. His laughter, usually loud and carefree, was quieter now, as if he was being cautious, measured. Carla couldn't understand it. She thought about the subtle exchanges earlier, how Sam's presence had shifted the energy in the room, how he seemed to be settling in too comfortably. There was a tension in the air, something that wasn't there before. She tried to focus on the steady rhythm of her breath, but her mind kept returning to that moment when Sam and her partner had paused mid-conversation, the awkward silence that had followed. It felt like they were keeping something from her, like there was an unspoken understanding between them that she wasn't part of. The more she thought about it, the harder it became to ignore the growing discomfort gnawing at her. The night stretched on, with every minute that passed making Carla more restless. The strange feeling didn't go away, and as much as she tried to push it aside, she couldn't. The tension was still there, lingering in the shadows, and it had only grown stronger. The quiet of the house was interrupted in the middle of the night by the sudden buzz of a phone. The sound cut through the stillness, its urgency stirring Carla from her restless sleep. Her partner's phone, which had been lying on the nightstand, vibrated sharply. Carla opened her eyes, briefly unsure of where she was, before glancing at the device. She noticed the unfamiliar name flashing on the screen, a name she hadn't seen before. It was a name she had no reason to recognize. She couldn't help herself. Her curiosity pulled her in. She reached over to pick up the phone, her fingers brushing the cool surface of the screen. Before she could even read the message, the phone was quickly snatched away from her grasp. Her partner, still half asleep, muttered something indistinct and immediately locked the phone. Carla's breath caught in her throat, but she said nothing. She didn't even question the sudden movement or the fleeting panic in her partner's eyes. Something about it didn't sit right with her. Carla lay back down, her mind racing. She closed her eyes, but the sense of unease wouldn't let her rest. The phone buzzed again, this time with a new message, and she could feel the tension rising in her chest. Her partner had been quick to dismiss it earlier, but the name on the screen had lingered in her mind. Carla knew it wasn't just a coincidence. She watched as her partner, pretending to fall back to sleep, fumbled with the phone in their hands, sending a quick reply. Each movement seemed calculated, practiced. A pit formed in Carla's stomach, but she couldn't place why it felt so wrong. Maybe it was the strange urgency in the way the messages were sent, or the way the phone was treated as something fragile, as though it held a secret too precious to be seen. As the phone sat untouched on the nightstand, Carla's eyes never left it. It wasn't just a phone anymore. It had become a symbol of something hidden, something she wasn't supposed to know. The buzzing stopped for a moment, but the silence that followed felt suffocating. Every second felt like an eternity, and the more she thought about it, the more the gnawing suspicion began to take hold. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting pale streaks across the room. Carla woke up feeling like the night had been long, though the hours had passed quickly in the dark. She could sense the distance between her and her partner, the space growing wider with every passing moment. Her partner was already up, moving around the kitchen, but the energy in the house felt different. The usual rhythm of the morning, shared cups of coffee, casual conversations, was missing. Instead, there was a tension in the air that couldn't be ignored. Sam, sitting quietly at the kitchen table, didn't speak much. His eyes were downcast, his fingers tapping restlessly on his mug. The usual chatter between him and his aunt had faded into an awkward silence, and though the room was filled with sounds, clinking cups, the whir of the blender, there was an undeniable discomfort in the space. Carla, watching from the doorway, couldn't help but notice how quiet things had become. Sam seemed too still, too focused on his own thoughts, his usual energy drained. When Carla entered the kitchen, her partner was already at the counter, sorting through things as if there was something to occupy their attention, anything to avoid eye contact. The small, everyday exchanges felt forced now, like each word was chosen with care, measured for its potential consequences. Carla tried to ask Sam about his plans for the day, but the words didn't land. He gave a short answer and turned his attention back to the untouched plate of food in front of him. The phone, which had remained silent for the most part, buzzed again. Carla glanced at her partner, who quickly picked it up and swiped it away, almost as if trying to shield it from prying eyes. The small, subtle movements told her everything she needed to know. Something was off, and she could no longer pretend it wasn't. She looked at Sam again, his gaze now fixed on the floor, avoiding her eyes. The unease continued to grow. As Carla moved about the house, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that something had shifted between them all. Sam's silence was no longer the comfortable quiet of a visiting guest. It was the silence of someone holding something back, someone who knew more than they were letting on. Every glance, every small interaction, seemed to carry more weight than it should. And Carla couldn't escape the feeling that the secrets they were all keeping were about to unravel. The day stretched on with a heavy, uncomfortable stillness. Carla went through the motions of daily life, her actions mechanical, her mind elsewhere. The house felt too quiet, too empty, even with Sam and her partner still present. Carla couldn't shake the feeling that something was out of place. The strange behavior, the odd silences, it was all too much to ignore now. Later that afternoon, with her partner out for a while, Carla found herself alone in the house. The silence was overwhelming, pressing in on her from every corner. She wandered aimlessly for a few minutes, trying to distract herself, but the nagging suspicion only grew stronger. She knew she shouldn't, but she couldn't resist. She went through her partner's things, searching for answers that she hadn't been able to find elsewhere. It was in the drawer, tucked away behind a few miscellaneous papers, that she found them, the photos. At first, she didn't know what to make of them. But as she looked closer, the realization hit her like a punch to the stomach. The images were of Carla and Sam, together in ways that shouldn't have been. The closeness, the intimacy, it was all too much to ignore. These weren't just casual pictures. They were moments, shared between them, hidden from her. The betrayal stung deeply, but it wasn't just the photos that disturbed her. It was the knowledge that this had been going on for months, quietly building behind her back. Her hands trembled as she turned the photos over, trying to make sense of it all. The weight of the discovery pressed down on her chest, suffocating her. Her mind raced, searching for answers, but none came. It didn't make sense. How could they hide something so huge from her? How had she missed it? The phone buzzed again, and this time, it was her partner's name flashing on the screen. Carla stared at it for a long moment before she could bring herself to pick it up. Her hands felt cold as she scrolled through the messages, texts, photos, conversations that were never meant to be seen. Carla's stomach churned as she pieced together the fragments of a story she hadn't known existed. The reality of what was happening hit her all at once. She had been deceived, manipulated, and lied to in ways she hadn't even imagined. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. Her partner had returned, and the moment of discovery was over. Carla quickly shoved the photos back into the drawer, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew there was no going back now. The secret had been uncovered, and everything was about to change. The tension in the house had reached its breaking point. Carla couldn't ignore it any longer. The discovery of the photos, the hidden messages, the undeniable evidence, it all pointed to one thing. She had been betrayed by the two people she trusted most. Every glance, every passing moment between her partner and Sam felt like an unspoken truth hanging in the air, waiting to be revealed. It was impossible to pretend it didn't exist. That evening, Carla could no longer hold back. Her hands trembled as she picked up the photos, the evidence of their deceit. She had to confront them, had to make them face what they had done. The silence between them was suffocating, and every second felt like an eternity. She moved into the living room, where her partner and Sam were, both of them sitting in uneasy silence. Carla didn't waste time with pleasantries. She placed the photos on the table between them, her breath shallow, her heart racing. Sam froze, his face draining of color as he saw the pictures. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Carla's eyes locked onto his, and she could see the guilt in his eyes. There was nothing left to hide. Her partner, too, looked taken aback. They hadn't expected this moment, hadn't prepared for the confrontation. Their eyes flickered between the photos and Carla, but they couldn't look her in the eye for long. The truth was out, and there was no turning back. Carla didn't need to hear excuses or apologies. The silence between them was enough to speak volumes. Carla didn't give them a chance to explain. She didn't want to hear the justifications, the excuses. The damage had been done. She had been kept in the dark for too long, and now the truth was laid bare. Her partner tried to speak, but Carla cut them off. The words didn't matter anymore. What had been done could not be undone. Sam, for the first time, seemed truly remorseful. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, unable to meet Carla's eyes. There was no anger in his expression, just guilt and shame. Carla's eyes hardened. She couldn't look at him the same way anymore. The trust that had once existed was gone, replaced by a cold realization of betrayal. The confrontation was short, sharp, and painful. Carla didn't waste time with further questions. She already knew everything she needed to know. The damage had been done, and the people she had loved and trusted were no longer the same to her. She didn't know what would come next, but she knew that this was the moment that would change everything. The silence after the confrontation was deafening. There were no apologies, no attempts to make amends, just the heavy weight of the truth settling into the room. The future seemed uncertain, and all Carla could do was try to process the broken pieces of the life she had once known. The days that followed the confrontation were filled with an unbearable stillness. Carla moved through the house like a ghost, each room a reminder of the betrayal that had unfolded within its walls. Sam, still staying with them, avoided her whenever possible. The guilt in his eyes was palpable, but it did nothing to ease the ache in her chest. Her partner, on the other hand, had fallen into a quiet, defensive shell, unwilling or unable to face what had happened. Carla spent her days in a fog, each passing hour a blur of thoughts and emotions she couldn't fully process. The photos, the texts, the lies, they kept circling in her mind like an endless loop. The more she thought about it, the more the weight of the revelation hit her. Sam and her partner hadn't just been secretly involved. They had done this in her own home, under her roof, in a place that should have been her sanctuary. Every quiet moment between them, every small, intimate exchange, now felt like a violation. She couldn't escape the images in her mind, the way they had looked at each other, the way their smiles had been so knowing, so secret. It was like they had been living a double life, one that she hadn't been a part of, one that she had never suspected. And that was what hurt the most, how easy it had been for them to hide it from her. She had trusted them both with everything, and they had betrayed that trust without a second thought. Carla tried to keep herself busy, but everything reminded her of the fracture in her life. She avoided looking at Sam, and whenever she did, the guilt and shame in his expression only fueled her anger. There were no apologies, no attempts to explain why it had happened. She didn't want the reasons. There was no justification for what they had done, no excuse that could make it right. One evening, while her partner was out running errands, Carla went through the messages again. The texts were still there, a chilling reminder of the time that had been stolen from her. She had already seen them once, but the need to confirm what she had found was overpowering. As she scrolled through the conversations between her partner and Sam, one text caught her eye. It was from her partner, sent late at night, only hours before Sam had arrived at the house. The text read, "We need to be careful. Carla can't find out about us. It's too risky." Carla froze. The words felt like a slap in the face. They hadn't just been careless, they had been calculating, aware of the risks, and yet they had gone ahead with it anyway. The revelation sent a shockwave through her, as if everything she had known about their relationship had been a lie. This wasn't just a mistake or a fleeting moment of weakness. This had been a deliberate, ongoing betrayal. Her heart raced as she stared at the phone screen, the weight of the truth settling in. They had been hiding something far more insidious than she had realized. The lie wasn't just about the affair, it was about everything. It was about the trust that had been shattered, the sense of security that had crumbled beneath her. And in that moment, Carla knew there was no going back. Everything had changed. The silence in the house had become deafening. It was as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to break the stillness. Carla moved through her day mechanically, performing tasks without really seeing them. Her thoughts were elsewhere, swirling with anger, hurt, and disbelief. Sam, who had once been like family, now felt like a stranger. Each time she passed him, she couldn't escape the nagging feeling that he had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Carla had tried to keep things civil, but every interaction felt strained, uncomfortable. Her partner, too, seemed distant, avoiding eye contact, retreating further into themselves. It was as if neither of them knew how to fix what had been broken. And for Carla, it seemed impossible to repair what had been shattered beyond recognition. The trust, the bond they once shared, was gone. Each day felt like a slow unraveling of everything she had known. There was no going back to what it had been before. No amount of apologies could undo the betrayal. Carla didn't want to hear excuses anymore, didn't want to listen to explanations that could never make sense of what had happened. She had been kept in the dark for too long, and now that the truth was out, it left nothing but a bitter taste in her mouth. Sam remained in the background, a silent presence in the house. He stayed to himself, only coming out when necessary, but even then, there was a coldness between them. Carla couldn't look at him without remembering everything she had found. The photos, the messages, it was all too much. She couldn't help but wonder how long this had been going on, how long they had been deceiving her. As the days passed, the tension in the house only grew. Carla's partner made no attempt to reach out, to repair the damage. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, with guilt and regret hanging in the balance. Carla had stopped hoping for some form of reconciliation. She no longer believed that it was possible. One evening, Carla came home to find her partner and Sam in the living room, speaking in hushed tones. The sight of them together, so casual, so familiar, made her stomach churn. It was like everything she had ever believed in had been a lie. They were too comfortable with each other, too at ease in the space that should have been hers. The betrayal had seeped into every corner of the house, making it feel less like a home and more like a prison. Sam didn't look up when Carla entered the room, and neither did her partner. It was as if they had already accepted the unspoken truth that things could never be the same again. Carla felt a rush of frustration flood her chest. She had been patient, had tried to make sense of everything, but it was clear now that there was no fixing this. The relationship, whatever it had been, was over. As Carla turned to leave the room, the weight of the situation pressed down on her. She didn't know what came next, but she knew that nothing would ever be the same. The betrayal had been too deep, the lies too long-standing. And in that moment, Carla realized that the only way forward was to leave it all behind. The days blurred into one long, uncomfortable stretch of time. Carla went through the motions, but everything felt hollow. The house, once a place of warmth and comfort, now felt foreign to her. Every corner, every room, held a memory of what had been. The quiet moments, the conversations that had once seemed so normal, now felt like echoes of a life that no longer existed. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt, it was the slow disintegration of everything she had built with Sam and her partner. Sam stayed in his room, his presence a constant reminder of the betrayal. He had become a stranger to her, someone she couldn't bring herself to trust again. Every glance he threw her way was filled with guilt, but that wasn't enough to undo the damage. Carla couldn't look at him without feeling a deep, burning anger. The same anger she felt whenever she saw her partner, who remained distant, unwilling to face the mess they had created. There were no attempts to rebuild the broken pieces, no gestures to show remorse or a desire to fix things. Carla's partner had become a shadow of the person she once knew. The constant avoidance, the refusal to acknowledge the destruction they had caused, it left Carla feeling cold and alone. She wanted to confront them, to demand answers, but there was no point. The truth had been laid bare, and the words left unspoken between them were louder than anything that could be said aloud. It wasn't just the affair, it was the way they had both treated her, as if she were the last person to matter. Carla found herself retreating more and more into herself, closing off from the world. She spent hours in silence, her mind racing through every detail of what had happened. She could no longer escape the images, the photos, the texts, the little moments that now seemed so obvious in hindsight. It was as if everything she had known had been a lie. The trust she had placed in both Sam and her partner had been shattered, and there was nothing left to hold on to. The tension in the house was unbearable, but neither Sam nor her partner seemed willing to address it. They both seemed to live in a kind of denial, hoping that time would somehow heal the wounds. But Carla knew better. Time didn't heal the broken pieces of a relationship. It only made the cracks more visible, more painful. One evening, after another long day of silence, Carla sat alone in the living room. The walls seemed to close in on her as she tried to make sense of everything. She had spent so many years building her life with them, but now it all felt like it had been swept away in an instant. The reality of the situation hit her like a wave. There was no going back. The life she had once known was gone, and there was no way to salvage it. Carla didn't know what the future held. She didn't know how she was going to move forward, but she knew that she couldn't stay in this house any longer. The weight of the betrayal was too much to bear. She had to leave. She didn't know where she would go or what she would do, but staying here, surrounded by the people who had hurt her the most, wasn't an option anymore. It was time to walk away. It was time to rebuild, even if she didn't know where to start. Carla hadn't expected Sam to come to her after everything that had happened. After days of silence, of avoiding one another, he stood in front of her, looking like a shell of the person he once was. The guilt in his eyes was undeniable, but it wasn't just guilt that she saw. It was fear, and something deeper, something that she couldn't quite place. Sam had been a part of the betrayal, but now, standing before her, he seemed almost lost, unsure of where to go or what to say. She had expected more of the same, more excuses, more attempts to justify what they had done. But there was none of that. He didn't try to explain or make it right. Instead, he just looked at her, as if he were searching for some kind of answer in her eyes, something that could take away the weight of the consequences. Carla didn't know what to feel in that moment. She had been angry, hurt, confused, but now, seeing Sam standing there, something in her hardened. She couldn't help but feel a deep sense of betrayal, a sense that nothing between them could ever go back to how it had been. This wasn't just a family member who had made a mistake. This was someone who had crossed a line, someone who had actively participated in something that had broken everything she had known. Sam's voice trembled slightly as he spoke. He wasn't offering any solutions, no plea for forgiveness. There was no grand gesture, no attempt to undo what had been done. It wasn't about fixing the past. It was about facing the truth and accepting the weight of what had happened. Carla didn't know if that made her feel more betrayed or more pitying for him. There was no going back, no repairing the damage, but in his eyes, there was something that seemed desperate, something that begged for a chance, even if she wasn't sure it was deserved. Sam had come to her, but it wasn't for the reasons she expected. He wasn't trying to make things right. He was simply acknowledging what had already been broken. The reality of the situation sank deeper into Carla's mind. The lines between family, betrayal, and guilt had blurred in a way she couldn't untangle. She didn't know what the next step was, but she knew it wasn't here, not with him standing in front of her like this. For a moment, Carla stood frozen, unsure of what to say. The anger, the hurt, it all still lingered, just below the surface, but now there was something else. She couldn't put it into words, but she felt the weight of the situation, the finality of it all. Sam had come to face what he had done, but that didn't change the fact that everything had shifted. The world they had known was gone, and no apology, no gesture, could bring it back. Without saying another word, Carla turned and left the room. There was nothing more to say. The damage had been done, and it was time to accept it, even if it meant walking away for good. Sam could stand there, waiting for her to say something, but she knew that no matter what words passed between them, nothing would change the past. It was done. And for the first time, Carla felt a sense of finality that she hadn't been able to grasp before. There was nothing left to hold on to now. Everything had unraveled, and the only thing she could do was move forward, alone. Carla didn't expect closure, and yet it came in waves. The days after she had walked away from everything felt longer than any time she had ever known. She didn't know what she was supposed to do next or how she was supposed to feel. All the plans she had made, all the routines that once anchored her, seemed meaningless now. There was nothing left but the quiet aftermath of the chaos she had left behind. The house, once full of familiar sounds, felt empty. It was a space she had once called home, but now it was just walls and furniture, silent witnesses to everything that had happened. Carla had packed up what she needed, taking only the essentials. She couldn't bear to look at anything else, not yet. The memories were too fresh, too raw. She rented a small apartment in the city, far away from the house that had once been filled with laughter and conversation. The apartment was modest, but it was hers. The space was small enough that it didn't feel overwhelming, yet large enough to feel like a fresh start. Every corner held the potential for something new. She spent her days adjusting to a life that had shifted so dramatically, yet the routine gave her something solid to hold on to. Each morning, when she woke up in her new bed, it felt like a new chapter, one where she didn't have to carry the weight of betrayal on her shoulders. There were moments of doubt, of course. The nights were the hardest. In the stillness, Carla's mind often wandered back to the house, to Sam and her partner, to the life she had left behind. But the weight of their betrayal no longer felt so suffocating. It was a painful memory, but it was just that, a memory. The reality of it had started to fade, replaced by the reality of her new life. In her new apartment, Carla found peace in the small things. A quiet evening with a cup of tea, the sound of the city outside her window. She wasn't trying to forget, but she was learning to live with what had happened. The betrayal, the loss, it would always be a part of her. But it didn't define her. She wasn't broken. She was rebuilding, step by step, in a way that felt entirely her own. Her phone rarely buzzed anymore. There were no more messages from Sam, no more attempts from her partner to reach out. And though part of her had hoped for some sign of regret, some last-ditch effort to make things right, the silence was, in its own way, the final answer. They had made their choices, and Carla had made hers. There was no room left for reconciliation. What had been lost was lost for good. As time passed, Carla began to feel a sense of clarity. The pain, while still sharp at times, was no longer overwhelming. It had become a part of her story, not the whole story. She was learning to trust herself again, learning that she could find strength in her own decisions. She wasn't sure where this new path would lead, but she knew one thing: she wasn't alone. She had herself, and that was enough. The future was uncertain, but Carla had learned to take each day as it came. The broken pieces of her past had scattered, but she was piecing together something new, something stronger. It wouldn't be easy, but she was finally moving forward. And in that, she found the one thing she had been looking for all along: freedom.